shouldn't that be in the canon? A few years ago, it was the Gospel of Judas. You remember when this came out? That was fascinating. Apparently, the Gospel of Judas has its own little historical background that's interesting because apparently a guy had gotten a hold of it on the antiquities market, couldn't sell it, and stuck it in a safe deposit box in New York City for about 30 years. So just note to self here, if you have an ancient manuscript, don't put it in a safe deposit box. Because when he opened it 30 years later, it was in absolute shambles. It had just disintegrated. So they had to build this thing back up, but they did, and it turned out to be the Gospel of Judas, which is a real ancient gospel from probably 2nd or 3rd century that's in what we call an apocryphal gospel. People look at that and go, well, wait a second. Why shouldn't that be in the canon? My own doctoral dissertation was on an apocryphal gospel. It was so obscure it didn't even have a name, just a number. It's called Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 840. How's that? Sounds like a galaxy or a star system somewhere, doesn't it? It's like, is that like a supernova that exploded, or was that a manuscript? Oxyrhynchus 840. It's like, that's weird. So I didn't have a name. This was an apocryphal story of Jesus that was on a little miniature codex, probably dated around the 4th century. Maybe it was written somewhere around the 2nd. Yet another story of Jesus. What do we do with these? We're going to talk about that in here. But that continues to press the issue of canon, right? This is really what the Jesus Seminar became famous for. If you look at the history of gospel studies, I say this a little bit in my Gospels class, it's interesting when people are critiquing the Gospels for the first 100 years, 200 years of gospel criticism, from like the mid-1750s to the mid-1950s. You know what all the concern was? It was sort of synoptic problem, Q, earlier sources, and all that. And it wasn't really until the mid-20th century that someone said, hey, if we want to rethink Jesus, maybe we just ought to get some new material. And it suddenly dawned on people that, wait a second, for 200 years, when we've been studying the Gospels, we've just been using Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What? I got an idea. What if we use another gospel? And in 1950-ish, it was really 1945 when it started, because that's when a very famous discovery at Nag Hammadi, Egypt happened, and the Gospel of Thomas was discovered. And that just was like a bomb going off, and pretty soon everyone's like, well, look, how about that book? So you can see how that continues to bring up discussions of canon. Now, most recently, it was the Gospel of Jesus' wife. Did you guys hear about that 2 years ago? So the discovery of you guys need to read my website more. You can keep up on this sort of thing, right? The Gospel of Jesus' wife was supposedly discovered about 2 years ago. And I can remember seeing a photograph of it almost from the very start. Someone had sent it to me. Hey, did you see this? I looked at it. And my first inclination, having seen it, was this doesn't look right to me. This looks like a forgery. And I didn't break the story. The other scholars did it. But about 6 months in, it started looking like it was a forgery. And then now, in the last month, they've discovered who the forger was. And with almost mathematical certainty, not 100%, but they know who the guy is who had it, who no doubt made it, and fraudulently passed it off as a gospel manuscript to Karen King at Harvard University, who bought it hook, line, and sinker. And it says Jesus was married and all this craziness. Now it turns out it's a complete phony. But the world of apocryphal gospels, this is what made the Da Vinci Code so popular, right? I can't tell you how many Christians came to me in an utter panic over the Da Vinci Code. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I'm like, what are you going to do? It's a fictional book. There's nothing to do. And the facts that he gets right are very few, and even the ones that are right aren't meaningful, and on it go. But the point is that people get bothered by this. It enhances the discussion of the issue of canon. And then we go on and on here. I mean, believe it or not, we could have a whole class on apocryphal material. You're thinking, no, canon's enough. I don't want a whole class just on that. But we could easily do it. A third thing, and this is really important, and this is something that's going to come up again and again in this class. A third thing that's sort of exacerbated the canon discussion isn't just debate over authorship, not just apocryphal material, but thirdly, a scholar by the name of Walter Bauer. Now, I mentioned Walter Bauer a little bit in this book. I cover it in another book I've written called The Heresy of Orthodoxy. But in 1934, Walter Bauer wrote a very famous book called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity. Now, in 1934, no one was paying attention, though, to what Walter Bauer wrote, because Walter Bauer was in Germany in 1934. In 1934, no one was talking about Bauer's name. In 1934, they were talking about this guy named Adolf Hitler, who had just become the Führer of all of Germany in 1934. And so he wrote this book in obscurity. No one paid much attention, sat around for about 40 years. And then in 1971, it was translated into English. Pretty soon, everybody was talking about Walter Bauer. And here's Bauer's main thesis. His main thesis is that when you look at early Christianity, particularly the 2nd century, there is no such thing as early Christianity. In fact, when you look at early Christianity in the 2nd century, what you have is a variety of early Christianities, plural. All these different versions of Christianity, all claiming to be the original, all claiming to be right, all claiming to be apostolic, all claiming to be orthodox, and they're all over the map theologically. You've got the Marcionites, got the Ebionites, you've got the Gnostics, you've got the Valentinians, you've got the Montanists, you've got all these different heretical groups, all fighting it out for supremacy, all claiming to be original. And it wasn't really until one of those groups prevailed and that they won the theological wars in early Christianity, and they got the claim with their flag in the sand that they were the real Christianity. And the Christianity that you believe, says Bauer, the Christianity that you're so excited about now that you think is Christianity is just one version of Christianity in the early centuries, and this happens to be the version that won. But what if another version had won? What if the Gnostics had won? Then you wouldn't be thinking about Christianity like you think about now. You'd be thinking about it entirely differently, because that version of Christianity lost the theological wars and was suppressed and oppressed and so on, says Bauer. And then here's the kicker. This is where it gets back to Canon. Bauer says you have all these different Christianities. They all don't agree with each other. They're all fighting it out. They don't get along. No one agrees. And each of them have their own books. The books that they claim are the right ones. The books that they claim are the true ones. And guess whose books got to be in the canon, says Bauer? The books of the theological winners in this theological war. Now, when I say there's a war, I don't mean a literal war, of course. I mean a theological war. And when a group prevailed, theologically prevailed, they got to choose the books to go in the canon. So the books that you're reading now, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Romans, and 1 Corinthians, those just are the books of the theological winners, says Bauer. If the Gnostics had won, you wouldn't be reading that. You'd be reading Ptolemy's Epistle to Flora, the Gospel of Truth from Valentinius, or you'd be reading the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Philip, or you'd be reading some other Gnostic work out there, or the Apocalypse of Peter. You'd have a whole different book. In other words, why should you think your books are any better than someone else's books? You just have an arbitrary set of books just because that group won, but what makes those books right and other groups' books wrong? That is Walter Bauer's thesis. Now, in some ways, Walter Bauer is the sort of figure that looms over this whole class, because Walter Bauer's thesis about early Christianity and canon has been a tremendous influence on other scholars today. And one of the major guys who's a disciple of Walter Bauer is Bart Ehrman. If you don't realize it, Bart Ehrman's sort of spiel, right? His thing that he goes around and says and talks about is just Walter Bauer 2.0, okay? It's like someone stuck it in the microwave and hit reheat, right? And it's just the same thing again. What Ehrman has, though, what Bauer didn't, was that when Bauer wrote his book in 1934, we had hardly any apocryphal material at all. It was about 10 years after Bauer wrote in 1945 that we had the big explosion discovery in Nag Hammadi, which we'll talk about later, which helped his cause, unfortunately. So, what is a big influence on the canon debate? Walter Bauer's book. Now, all of that, then, is helping you set the scene and understand why this is a topic for today, right? Why are people talking about this today? This is the reason, because this is like a dripping faucet, right? Who wrote these books? Are there forgeries? What about apocryphal books? What about heresy and orthodoxy and early Christianity? Why these books and not others? This is just the continual sort of thing from modern scholarship. And if you read Bart Ehrman or Elaine Pagels or any of the major scholars today, you're going to realize that behind the scenes of the influence of these different people, particularly Bauer, helping guide what they say. Now, what's interesting about Bauer, we're not going to be able to go through this in this class fully, but his thesis about early Christianity was widely and roundly critiqued in the following years after he wrote it, and pretty much blown into 100 pieces. But you know what? If you believe a thing, it doesn't matter if it's been refuted, right? People just keep saying it over and over again, despite the fact that his thesis has been shot down time and time again. There is an insistence that Bauer must have been right. Now, he was right on one thing, and we're going to see this, is he was right that early Christianity was diverse theologically. It wasn't a monolithic entity. It wasn't like the 2nd century was this happy walk in the park for early Christianity where everyone held hands and sang Kumbaya and it was great. No, actually it was ugly at times. And there were Gnostics, and there were Valentinians, and there were Marcionites, and there were Ebionites, and there were all these different groups, and they were fighting it out. He's right about that. What he's wrong about is the implication of that. The implication being there can't be one right view, or the implication being that there was no core Christianity. Or the implication that, well, it's just a total toss-up. Who knows what's right? No. You can have dissent and still have a core true view, which is what we're going to argue for in here. What's interesting about Bauer's thesis is how attractive it is to the modern cultural mindset. Think about it. What does everyone in our culture always talk about? Diversity, right? And I don't mean ethnic diversity, although they talk about that too. What I mean when I say our culture talks about diversity, they mean religious diversity, right? Everybody has a different view. Everybody has a different philosophy. Everyone has a different religion. And you know what our culture always concludes from religious diversity? That no one view could be right. But it's that second step that's a philosophical mess. Any old person can observe philosophical and religious diversity. What you can't do, therefore, though, is reach a conclusion, which is the second step, that therefore no one view could be right or you can't know what view is right. Where's that second step come from? You got to prove that second step. You just can't make it. Here's what I want to suggest to you. What our culture is busy doing is taking that second step very quietly without having to need any justification at all. In other words, what our culture does and says, oh, look at all the disagreements out there theologically and pluralistically and philosophically. Therefore, no one can be right and you can't know what is right. That second step is made all the time, and no one bothers to raise your hand in the back of them and go, hold on a second. I agree with the first point. Of course there's a diversity of opinions. I don't agree with the second point, that therefore no one view can be right. How do you reach that second conclusion? Where does that come from? You just imported that into the argument. From where? From thin air? Did you make it up? The mere existence of diversity is not an argument that there can be no right view. And we're going to unpack this later in one of my other chapters in Canon Revisited, because it's a really critical point to get. Because if you don't get that point, you're going to find that little sleight of hand happening all the time, and people are just slipping that into the back door of the argument, and no one is noticing. Your job is to notice. Because if you don't notice, then you're just going to presume that their assumption is right. And it's going to make Christianity look really stupid. Because we're going to be like, no, we actually think that we're right. And they're like, oh, well, you're breaking the rules of the game. The sheer existence of diversity proves no one can be right. You're like, well, why is that true? And you realize when someone is actually forced to defend that, they don't have an answer, philosophically. Just because there's disagreement doesn't mean someone's not right. Even Jesus got disagreement. Even people in Jesus' own day thought he was the devil. Does that mean, therefore, he's not the Son of God? So Bauer had a huge influence here, and we just got to sort of let that be known as part of what's driving this course and driving this discussion. Now, I want to transition with that in mind to the point of the class. And this is where, as you can see there in your notes, we're going to talk about the distinction between two different kinds of objections to canon, what's called the de facto objection and the de jure objection. And I can tell you this, if you don't get that, you're not going to understand the class, and you're certainly not going to understand the book, because the way we frame both those things is based on getting this particular nuance of what the objection is we're trying to answer. When you hear all these attacks that the Bible's not written by who it says it is, there's forgeries, Walter Bauer's heresy and orthodoxy stuff, you can understand what might be called an epistemological crisis happening with the average believer. They have this sort of intellectual panic, right? How can I be sure? How can I know? Maybe what Christians believe is just a total shot in the dark. Maybe it's blind faith. Yeah, I believe it, but I got no grounds for believing it, right? My belief isn't justified. My belief isn't warranted. So with that concern in mind, the purpose of this class and the purpose of the book is to argue that the Christian belief in canon is justified, is warranted, right? That it has an intellectual basis to it, that it is grounded in something. Now, once you say that's what you're doing, you're answering a certain kind of objection, okay? And this is where we need to define what we mean by de facto objections and de jure objections. And these are so closely related that people blur them and they mix them up. And if you blur it or mix it up, you're going to be confused on what's going on. So let me explain the difference between the two of those. First, the de facto objection. The de facto objection to Christianity is an argument that says the Christian belief in canon should be rejected because it's wrong, it's false, it's mistaken, it's incorrect. Now, as you can imagine, this is what I mean by de facto. According to fact or by reality, de facto, the Christian belief in canon is mistaken, therefore it should be rejected as a belief, so the argument goes. This is probably the most common way you think about objections. You think about objecting to something because it's wrong. It's incorrect. It's not true. Okay? And we make de facto objections about lots of things in the world, and people make a lot of de facto objections about Christianity, right? You shouldn't believe in the Christian God because he doesn't exist. Okay? It's a mistaken belief. Okay, that would be a de facto objection to the existence of God. a de facto objection to canon, then, is that you shouldn't believe that the canon is made up of these 27 books because a bunch of them are forgeries, or because, there's no distinction between these and apocryphal books, or, and on you can go. Now, what's interesting about the de facto objection to canon is we're not going to try to answer it. That doesn't mean we don't think the canon is the correct one, or we don't think it's a true belief. We do. We're not defending, though, in this class, that it's a true belief. In fact, what we're doing in this class is a little different. We're defending that it's a justified belief, that it's a warranted belief. Is there anything distinctive about those two? Yes, because if we're going to try to prove that the canon is a justified or warranted belief, we're actually answering a different objection, which is called the de jure objection. The de jure objection is a type of philosophical objection that you may not be used to because we don't make it much, or at least we don't know we're making it if we're making it to things. The de jure objection is an objection that a certain belief is not to be held, not because it's true or false, but because someone doesn't have a basis for holding it. Okay, it has no warrant, has no justification. So the de jure objection to the canon, then, is an objection to the canon not on the basis of whether it's true or false or whether it's the right or wrong 27 books, but on the basis that Christians can never know that in the first place. The de jure objection, then, is an objection on whether something could be known, not whether you're right about what you think you know. So the non-Christian de jure objection goes like this. Man, you Christians may be right about these 27 books, but it's a total shot in the dark. You don't know, you can't know, no one can know. It's a complete intellectual leap of faith. It's unwarranted, unjustified. You have no basis for knowing, no grounds. Regardless of whether it's true, you have no grounds for thinking it's true. You could theoretically have a belief that happens to be true, but no grounds for knowing it. I mean, even a broken clock is right twice a day, right? I mean, you can happen to be right, but have no grounds for thinking that you are. So the de jure objection is a very distinctive kind of objection to Christianity. Now, you may think, well, yeah, but that's a lesser objection. Isn't the bigger objection the de facto one? Not so fast. The de jure objection actually may be the bigger problem. And it may be the bigger problem because the de jure objection gets at the basis of what you can claim, or what can be known, what can be ruled out. The de jure objection sort of says, look, you Christians aren't allowed to make these claims because you get no basis for them, whether you're right or wrong. You can't even get in the game because you don't have a basis or a grounds for thinking you can know such a thing in the first place. So what you might notice about the de jure objection is that it actually is more fundamental. It's more piercing. It's more deep. Now, if you're wondering what de jure means basically according to law or by right. This is the difference between de facto and the de jure. De facto is what's true. De jure is what sort of ought to be. By the way, don't confuse de jure with de jour. If you go and ask for the soup de jour, all right, that's the soup of the day. This is not the objection of the day, that de jour. This is de jure, which means according to law or by right. So I'll give you an example of the difference between de facto and de jure. Think about a king for a moment who's just a puppet king, and he's not really running the country. If you had a situation like that, you might say, well, the de jure king or the de jure queen is Queen Elizabeth, but the de facto queen is actually so-and-so. They're the ones really running the country. Okay? So you got someone who's the king by right or the queen by right, and then you have someone who's the king or queen by fact or by reality, right? So when we talk about the de jure objection to canon, we're talking about an objection that says Christians have a belief in canon, but regardless of whether it's true or false, not touching that, you Christians don't have a right to even make the claim that these are the right 27 books because you have no basis for knowing. Now, if that's the case, what we want to know is whether we do have a basis for knowing. So what I want to get at here in this class, and what I get at in Canon Revisited, is to make the argument we have a basis for knowing. I want you to understand when this class is over how you know, or how Christians know, or why Christians can have any basis for saying these are the right 27 books and no others. Now, if that's the goal of the class, then there's a few clarifications that brings up about what this class is trying to accomplish and not trying to accomplish. Let me just make some clarifications on that. First, the purpose of this class, I hope this is clear, and certainly it's become clear if you understand the difference between the de facto and de jure questions. The purpose of this class is not to offer some sort of empirical evidentialist proof for canon, okay? I'm not trying to teach you how to prove the canon to your non-Christian friend. I don't even know if that's something we should say can be done in any sort of way that people think it can be done. Like, here, I'm going to pull up this syllogism on the board and prove to you the canon. No, to our non-Christian friend, doesn't work that way. So we're not going to attempt to do that. That's not even going to be our goal. Our goal, rather, is to say that the intellectual belief that Christians hold that these are the right 27 books is actually intellectually justified. In other words, we have a basis for knowing this. The non-Christian may not like that basis. He may not even agree with that basis. But what he cannot claim when our argument is over is that we have no reasonable and rational basis within our worldview for thinking that we can know. A second implication, though, of this, which is really important to get for where we're going in this class, is not so that you don't have the perception that we're trying to prove to the skeptic that the canon is true. That was the first thing. Okay? We're not going to go out and have this sort of evidentialist free-for-all. We're like, well, we'll prove it to you. As we'll see, it doesn't work that way. But the second implication, if we're dealing with this de jure question, is the kind of things that we'll consider relevant for our exploration. If the issue here is justifying our knowledge of canon, then we're going to have to talk about how Christians know things. And once we start having to talk about how Christians know things, we're going to have to talk about what Christians believe about how knowledge is attained, which includes what Christians believe about God and what Christians believe about the way He reveals Himself and the way the Bible works and how revelation takes place and all the Christian beliefs about natural law and sin and fallenness of human beings and so on. In other words, if we're going to ask whether Christians are justified in believing in canon, we're going to have to do it on Christian terms. This is the big point I want you to get. Our argument is going to be an argument based on the Christian worldview. And if you understand what we're doing here, that's an absolute inevitability. Think about it for a moment, just to phrase it differently. If someone comes to you and goes, the Christian worldview provides no basis for knowing which books are in the canon and which books aren't, if someone makes that claim and our response is, yes, the Christian worldview does provide a basis for knowing that, then how can I show that without talking about what the Christian worldview is and what we believe and what God is like and how God reveals Himself? In other words, what you'll notice in this class and in this book is that we're going to try to respond to the de jure objection on Christian terms, which means we'll be making theological arguments about the way God works, the way God reveals Himself, how the church operates, what the church is like, how you know things as a believer, why the unbeliever can't know things, and so on. So when someone then raises their hand in the back of the classroom and says, hold on a second, you aren't making a neutral argument. You're using Christian terms and Christian assumptions when you make your argument. Our response is, well, of course, because we're answering the de jure objection. The de jure objection is that you Christians you have no basis for knowing. The only way I can answer that is to tell you about how Christians know things. Yes, we do have a basis. Here's what Christians believe about how knowledge is attained. There's our basis. What this means then is that you're not going to get in here some neutral, evidentialist, sort of external standpoint look at canon where you prove it to the skeptic with no Christian assumptions whatsoever. First of all, I don't think that's even possible to do. But secondly, we're not even going to try to do it because our goal isn't that anyway. Our goal isn't to prove the canon in some de facto sense. Our goal is to answer the de jure objection, which means we've got to do it on Christian terms. All of that is to simply say that the way we're going to defend the canon here is going to be by using the Christian worldview in its own reasoning, its own terms, and its own theology to talk about whether Christianity provides a basis for knowing something like this. And so it won't be anything other than a theological argument. It'll have historical components to be sure, but it'll be a theological and philosophical argument, not some neutral evidentialist argument. And that's inevitable if we're going to answer the de jure objection. Now, at this point, someone might say, well, golly, when are you going to write the book about the de facto objection? Right? And I actually don't think it's needed. And what I mean by that is the real goal I have here is to give Christians reassurance that what they know is not a blind leap of faith. What you know can be known. Or another way to say it is that God has provided a mechanism for knowing what you think you know. If it's not clear yet, by the way, you can know something but not know that you know it. I know this sounds crazy. Or a better way to say it is, you can have knowledge and not be able to account for it. All of you have knowledge of canon, that you think these are the right 27 books. Whether you can account for that knowledge is a separate question, right? And I want what the goal of this class is to help you to account for it, to show that it's justified knowledge. So there's a difference between having knowledge separately from accounting for knowledge and giving a justified reason why your knowledge is rational and reasonable. And it's that second thing that our goal in this class is designed to accomplish. So if that's the goal of the class, here's where we're going. We're not going to start with a bunch of historical facts in here. If you've read the book, you already know that, right? We could do what Metzger does and say, okay, we're going to answer that de jure objection. Here's all the evidence. That doesn't answer the question, okay? If we're going to deal with the de jure objection, we got to start with the way you think about canon on a theological level. So the whole first section of this class is going to be an examination of canonical models, okay? Canonical models, which we're getting ready to jump into in just a minute, are the different ways that different people have tried to explain how they know which books are in and which books they are out. Or another way to say it is canonical models exhibit different ways that groups try to authenticate canon. They all have different ways of doing it. And we're going to talk about what we think is a viable way of authenticating canon. Then, after we're done with looking at all the canonical models and laying out the model that we think is the right one, then we're going to start looking at, in the second half of this course, what we might call potential defeaters to that model. A defeater, and I'll explain this more a little bit later, is just something that is a new piece of information that may come along that sort of does away with the prior belief you have. So you could have a prior belief that's entirely justified, but then when you get a defeater, you realize, oh, now that I have that information, my prior belief is no longer justified if it's a valid defeater. So we're going to look at certain defeaters and ask whether they really do shoot down the New Testament canon like they claim. I gave an example. I may even give this example in my book. I can't remember, but I've given it in lectures. A good example of how a defeater could eliminate a justified belief is imagine you wake up in the morning, you look at your clock beside your bed, and you realize you're late for work. Okay, clock says 9 a.m. or late for class, and probably your life, right? Dr. Kruger's class. Oh no! All right. So you wake up in the morning, you look at your alarm clock. It says 9 a.m. and you're like, okay, I'm late. I'm late for class. Now, you've formed a belief, namely that you're late for class, based on looking at your alarm clock. Is that belief warranted, justified? We could go into all the philosophical reasons it is, right? Which is that normally your alarm clock's right? Your sense perception is normally accurate. You look at it, it says 9. You have no reason to think all these reasons think that you're justified in believing you're late. But then your wife comes in and goes, oh, I forgot to tell you that your little boy Johnny's been messing with your clock, and pushing buttons and, messing with the time and everything like that, and it's probably all out of whack. Now what just happened? You had a justified belief, namely that you're late for my class, and then you just got a defeater that just shot it to pieces, right? Oh, my son's been jacking around with my alarm clock. It's probably not right. Now my formerly justified belief just evaporates. So here's what we're going to do in this class. We're going to talk about why we believe the belief in canon is justified, but then we're going to look at potential defeaters. Those potential defeaters do away with our justified belief? Of course, we're going to answer no, but we have to look at them one by one. And so the entire second half of this course is going to be looking at these potential defeaters and asking whether they really do shoot down our view of canon. Okay, so that's where we're going, macro view.
The preceding program has been brought to you by Reformed Theological Seminary and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.